In previous videos, we covered how attackers gain initial access to your machine. In this video, I want to talk about what attackers can do after they've already gained that initial access. We'll use a combination of privilege escalation and lateral movement techniques to gain further control over that machine. Taking a look at the common attack vectors cheat sheet or checklist, if you scroll down, take a look at the privilege escalation section, you'll notice a lot of, in my opinion, the most common vulnerabilities associated with privilege escalation. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, and there are tons and tons of different vulnerabilities that attackers can abuse to escalate privileges. In fact, if I wanted to teach all of them, I'd have to make a whole separate course on it. I highly recommend checking out the Linux privilege escalation checklist on Hacktricks to learn more. It has a more complete list. In addition to this list, if you click on each of these subtopics, it will also provide you commands that as an attacker you can use to take advantage of that vulnerability and escalate privileges. In here, you'll find the ones that we'll be talking about in this video, but you'll also find many, many more. Going back to my attacking machine, there are many different ways of gaining initial access to our target, which we covered in previous videos. The one thing that they all have in common is that they result in the attacker having a shell or terminal session with their target where they can send commands and receive responses. In order to emulate that, I'm just going to pretend that we discovered some user hacker with password ABC123, and we can connect as user hacker through SSH. So if I say SSH hacker at, and then my target, and then I provide the password of ABC123, we're now logged in, and now we can start talking about how we're going to switch from hacker to a user with potentially more privileges like root. The first thing that I'd like to point out is now that we're in the machine itself, we can again take advantage of any of the same vulnerabilities that we could take advantage of from outside the machine, and potentially even more. If I say netstat or ss, I believe in this case it's going to be ss-plunt, I can see a list of listening services. And if there's a vulnerability in any of these services, just like with initial access, I could take advantage of that vulnerability the same way to then gain access potentially as a different user. You might even notice some ports that are open internally that are not accessible from the outside. Either they're being firewalled or they're only available within that machine itself. In this case, we see port 3306 MySQL, which in a previous video, we switched so that it's only running internally and so that it can't be accessible remotely. However, now that we have access to this machine, we could actually forward that port over to our attacking machine and run attacks that way, potentially compromising the SQL service. So all of the attacks that we previously talked about when we were talking about initial access, they still apply when we've already made it onto the machine and we're talking about lateral movement and privilege escalation. The real question is, as an attacker, how can you abuse those vulnerabilities to maybe gain access that you didn't already have when you got your first initial foothold? Anyway, I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to talk about things that are associated only with privilege escalation or lateral movement once you already get into the machine. The first thing that I like to look at as an attacker is if this distribution of Linux is outdated. If it's sufficiently outdated, you might find some publicly known vulnerabilities, for example, in the kernel or the operating system itself, or in one of the software packages that comes shipped with the operating system. Perhaps we can abuse that vulnerability to then switch from our limited user privileges to root. Looking for these manually would be pretty difficult, so the way I like to do it is I like to take scripts that are publicly available and I like to run them to see if maybe they're able to catch any vulnerabilities associated with known vulnerable distributions of Linux. One example of a tool that you can use is Linux Exploit Suggester. So Linux Exploit Suggester is actually a package that you can install in Kali Linux. So you can install it with sudo apt install linux exploit suggester. I already installed it, but just to show you how I might do that, I will try to install it again. So I'll say File, New Tab to keep my initial access on the machine in that other tab. But then in this tab, I'm going to do stuff on my Kali machine, and I'm going to say sudo apt install linux exploit suggester. I have to enter my password. You'll notice it's already installed. Once it's installed, I can go to user share linux exploit suggester. And if I print out the files, you see we have this linux exploit suggester script that we can run to potentially check for an outdated version of Linux. If we take a look at its help screen, you'll notice that there are a couple ways we can do this. We can provide the kernel version of our target, or we can provide the full uname-a string run on our target. So I'm actually going to do the second one because I think this is easier. So I'm going to run /linux exploit suggester to run that script. I'm going to say -u, and then I'm going to provide the full output I get back when I run uname-a on the target. Why is uname-a potentially important? Well, uname-a provides information about the distribution of Linux that we're actually running, including the kernel version, in this case 6.1.0. So a script like Linux exploit suggester will look at that kernel version, and then we'll look for known exploits associated with that kernel version. So I'll right-click, copy this, and I'll enclose it in single quotes and paste it here. The reason I'm putting it in single quotes is so that it treats it all as one command and doesn't treat special characters like this number symbol differently. Anyway, when I run that, if this version of Linux were vulnerable to a known exploit, it would list that here in the possible exploits section. And in addition to the exploit itself, or the vulnerability itself, it would give you some code that you could potentially use to then take advantage of that vulnerability and switch to a different user, usually root. In this case, I'm running the latest version of Debian, so I highly doubt that there are going to be any known vulnerabilities associated with that version at this time. If I go back to my Debian machine, another thing I can do is I can actually get the version of Linux that I'm running, and I can look it up on Google and see if there are any possible exploits that somebody mentioned online somewhere. The way I like to do that is by printing out a file that's present in all of the major distributions of Linux. It's either called os-release or lsb-release. So I like to print out cat etc *-release, and then no matter what it's called, it'll print it out. And from here, you can see that we're running Debian 12 bookworm. So I can actually go back to my web browser, and I can say Debian 12 exploit and see if anything pops up. I could potentially look at vulnerabilities associated with Debian 12, and I'm really looking for something that says like privilege escalation or something of that sort. But again, this is the latest version of Debian, so I'm not likely to find anything super interesting, so that was kind of a dead end. What else can I do?